Hi everyone, this is Edessa from Web Courseworks. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I would like to direct you to your control panel where you will find your questions pane. Please use the questions pane if you have any questions or comments during the webinar, or if you experience any technical issues. We would like to thank Org Community. Org Community connects association executives and industry partners through online discussion forums, programs, and webinars. We encourage you to subscribe to Org Community for even more online and live education programming and fulfill all of your annual CAE requirements in one place. Some upcoming events for us, we are going to PersoniFest this year, and John Alexson, the CEO of Web Courseworks, will be speaking on Tuesday, April 9th at 10:50 about using data to prove membership ROI. He will be speaking with Rusty Howell, Director of Information Technology in ASRM, and David DiLorenzo of Association Analytics. Okay, let me introduce our speakers for today. Mary Mice is the VP of Implementations and Content Development at Web Courseworks, and she will introduce our next speaker. Mary, take it away.
Great, thank you, Edessa. We also have with us today is Chris Green. He is a Senior Application Analyst with AT, and he is going to be working, or he's going to be speaking today with me, talking about the different integration points and success factors. So with our agenda today, so we're going to start off talking about the terms and definitions that come up when you do an integration. One of the things I find whenever working with other clients is that nomenclature or verbiage is something that kind of trips people up. So today I am going to set those definitions so you guys know what I'm talking about. We're also going to go over the common integration points, understanding the integration process. Eventually we'll talk about best practices and factors, and then we'll have some, and then also maintaining your integration. At the end, we will be opening up the floor for some questions. Okay. All right, so we are going to dive in. So for the terms and definitions, the first one I want to talk about is what is an integration. And this is where we're going to be bringing two pieces of software to form that one seamless experience for the user so that they see it as actually just one flow from one system to the other. The integration also will send data back and forth between these two systems, so they're working together as one. Now, today we're going to be talking about an integration with an AMS. That's an association management system. Most of you may have these. If you don't, that's okay. And an AMS is a place to keep track of your client and member information. This could be profile information, purchase information. We'll get into that in a little bit. An AMS is similar in design and function to a customer relationship management system, or a CRM. And some examples of AMSs that we work with here at Web Courseworks quite a bit is Personify, IMIS, Aptify, and NetForum. So one of the things, there are lots of ways that you can integrate. There are lots of programs that you can integrate with, but today we really are just going to be focusing on integrating with an AMS. The LMS, the Learning Management System, this is where the education happens. This is where your users will go to learn and manage their continuing education, where they can get credits or certifications. Next slide, please. Thank you. API. So now I'm getting a little bit more technical. So the API is the Application Programming Interface. And this is a set of subroutine definitions, communication protocols, and tools for building that software. So a lot of times in an implementation, we're going to say, hey, give us your API information, or during that integration. This is what I'm talking about, is we're really looking for that technical information that we can connect the two systems together. Web Courseworks has an API that allows for data to be passed to us and where we can also send out that information. So there are two types of APIs that we work with, SOAP, or the Simple Object Access Protocol. This is a messaging protocol. It's based mainly in HTML and XML. And we're not going to get too deep into this, too technical today, but SOAP is one that we use pretty regularly here at Web Courseworks and when we're doing our integrations. One that's becoming more popular, though, is REST API. And this is more of an architectural style for the designed networked applications. And it allows for multiple standards. I have been seeing in the past couple of years more of a trend towards the REST API and away from SOAP. But again, we're not going to get too deep into SOAP versus REST today. We're going to stay at a pretty high level. Chris, do you have anything to add to those definitions?
I don't, and that was a pretty good technical overview of those. So.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we are going to start with our first poll, and we're just curious, what type of AMS do you use? Some of you may have one that I mentioned earlier. Some may have a Salesforce base, or you may not have one at all. So just let us know. We'll give you a minute here to fill out that poll. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, and let's share those results. All right, so it looks like most of you are using an other or a none AMS. The next one, it seems like AMS. We have a couple of people that are using Personify and Salesforce. Aptify does not look like many of you are using that. So, okay, great. So, let's go on to the next slide, please. All right, so in this next section here, we are going to talk about the 3 most common integrations between an AMS and an LMS. Now, this is not, you have to have all of these or anything like that. This is just the 3 that we work with the most. SSO, the single sign-on, the e-commerce, or the purchase enrollment, and then the transcript write back. And for single sign-on, I'm just going to start with that one. This is where I'm talking about that seamless experience for the user from going from one software to the other. So learners will log into the AMS, and in one way or another, they're going to navigate to the LMS without having to re-authenticate. So they just see that information going from one to another, or they have that navigation going from one system to another. Now, during the SSO process, we're also transferring data from the AMS to the LMS. Now, whenever we are doing an integration, there is some required information that we ask for whenever doing that SSO process. The name for the user, their email address, and then the user's AMS ID. That AMS ID is the connector between the 2 systems, and that allows us to marry up the user profile from the AMS to the user profile on the LMS. Now, that's not all that we can do. So there are a lot of optional SSO fields and functions that we can bring over as well. We can bring over credentials. And something to think about too when you're doing an integration, think about what you want to have on the certificate if you're issuing one. Sometimes if you're working with doctors or nurses, they're going to want that credential at the end of their certificate, that MD or that NPN. So credentials are really important to think about, you know, or what other information you want. Do you want their city to be on that certificate? That's the type of information we would bring over on an SSO. So credentials are one that I see a lot coming over on a profile sync. The organization, so any sort of institution or company or organization that they're affiliated with is another thing that comes over quite a bit. City and state, the country, and I'm gonna go back to groups in just a second, but then also custom fields. So sometimes there are going to be some custom fields or custom information like a validation number or a licensing number that you would need to bring over for your certain needs. Every client is different, so we can also bring over custom fields as long as we know what that API call is going to be. So think about that. If you have a field in your AMS that you want to bring over to an LMS, think about what web service call that is, because we will need that. I want to go back to groups for just 1 second. The groups, we can group people in the LMS as they come over. So if you have a member or a non-member that are going to be utilizing the LMS, we can group them when they come over. We can segregate them into the different areas. So there's a lot of functionality around groups, and we also call them cohorts here at Web Courseworks, so that users can get into the courses that they're looking for or get into the education content. The one thing I would recommend whenever you're doing a profile sync with SSO is that the fields that you're bringing over from the AMS to the LMS should provide value to both you and to your learners. Sometimes it's easy to say, oh, I want their address to come over, or I want their first child's name to come over. And in some cases, that is necessary. But think about what you're bringing over so that you have what you need for your reporting purposes and that the user has what they need to complete their educational requirements. Chris, do you have anything to add on SSO?
Yeah, so I just wanted to mention a couple specific, custom fields that I have seen. And I think you may have already mentioned something similar to this, but for instance, a medical association may have a unique ID number for the member, not necessarily the AMS ID, but a different identifying number. For medical associations, this could be a number that, follows the doctor through their entire career. That might be something important that you want to identify them within the LMS. And I think you already mentioned certification info pertaining to what they want on their certificates. But if there's any other data you want pertaining to that, it's very easy to integrate that using these custom fields. And to bounce off what you said about the profile fields transferred from the AMS my best practice is to only transfer the data you need, because you already have that data in your AMS. So it's really redundant to have that data in two places.
Yeah, so at times we'll talk about the system of record. It's a term that we use during integrations of where that main system of record is going to be. And when you're doing an integration, in most circumstances, you will want that system of record to be your AMS. That is going to be your main location where you're going to manage the user information and the profiles. And the LMS is more a secondary place where that information is stored. So I agree with you, Chris. It's yeah, just what you need. All right, so the second piece of the integration is the e-commerce and purchase enrollment. And I'm going to let Chris talk about this.
Thank you. Yeah, so the purchase enrollment process is where the learner will place an order for the product on the AMS to be consumed by the LMS. And the typical implementation is that a course is set up in your website store and within the LMS. And then the user will then view the course options on your website to actually make that purchase. During the checkout process, your AMS will then tell the LMS who the purchaser is and what items and courses were purchased. And on this slide here, you can see just for Web Courseworks integration, they require your user AMS ID, your product ID, which is often the course code or the distinct product code that's set up for those courses within your AMS, and then as well as the order number for that purchase.
Right. And the thing about the reason why those are important for us is when the user comes over on SSO, we fill that order on the LMS side. We'll check to see if there are any open orders, and we'll reconcile it against what we have in the LMS. Now, one thing you would hope is that a user keeps on going back to your LMS and taking more content. So when they come back to the LMS, say a second or third time, and they SSO over, we're going to see that they already have that order fulfilled. So we don't have to re-enroll them or do anything. We can just leave that order alone and let the user continue on their education journey. All right, and Chris, can you tell us about the transcript write back?
All right, so then through your single sign-on, the user can automatically log into the LMS to complete a course. So when a course is completed, the LMS is going to then write back that completion data to the AMS, and that's going to include things like your credit hour types, your credit hours earned, and other completion data that you actually need in your LMS. And some of those other fields are on the screen here. As far as score, we'll capture a percentage of the score for a specific exam, completion status, whether they pass or fail. What is really cool about these configurations, and you can also determine what type of accreditation you have, whether you're you use CME, CLE, CE, or CEU as well. You can specify that on a course basis.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. Nope, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I had something to add to that.
Sure, go ahead.
So one of the things with the transcript write back, it is from like the course. And the nice thing about the course is you get to set those completion requirements. So if you want a user to take a quiz and a survey and claim credits, and once they can claim that credit, then the information goes back, it'll go back. So you do have some what's the word I'm looking for, some flexibility on how you want to set those standards and when that completion happens. Okay, so I do have a question here. Is the order always placed in the AMS? If so, do you want an intuitive interface for the learner to purchase a course? It must be with the AMS. That is a great question, and that's from Lindsay. So I have found it doesn't necessarily always have to be with the AMS. It really depends on what AMS that you're using and the catalog setup that you have and the catalog licensing that you have. Chris, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, from how I understand the question is if the order should actually be put back into the AMS, is that correct?
Mm.
Yeah. So from my perspective of working with the IMS AMS, it's always good to have that order within your system just for accounting purposes, reconciliation purposes, just so you know.
Right. What about free orders? What if there is no requirement to purchase this course? Like for a member, say members get free educational content. What do you recommend in that situation?
Yeah, so free content, an example I can think of would be, this might be a little more complex, but say you have an event and you want to give all those people who attended your event free access to content. We can either, you can work with your AMS vendor to basically auto-assign those courses to your members, or you could have them go through the process and actually purchase the course on your website, which they'll actually be purchasing it for a complimentary price.
Sure.
We've done either one of those configurations.
Right, and I can also say from the LMS side, we have allowed users to self-enroll into courses without having a purchase associated with. And then again, it gets a little bit more complex, but sometimes that we can write that completion data back to the AMS. But that's something that you definitely want to engage your vendor with if you wanted to go that route. There is another question. Are there LMS systems that are the system of record rather than the AMS? And that is from Michelle. And yes, there are at times clients that will want to make the LMS the system of record. So when we talk about the three elements of the integration, the SSO, the purchase enrollment, and the transcript write back, sometimes clients will not do that transcript write back to the AMS. They will leave that data in the LMS. And at that point, the system of record for educational content is the LMS. If we're talking about profile information, though, you'd still want the AMS to be your record on that case, because that's where your user is going to be able to manage their profile. Chris, anything to add to that?
I don't.
Okay, great.
All right. Yeah, so this is just an example of a member experience on your AMS. So, for example, displaying transcript data on your own member website. So this would give your members more of a self-service approach to viewing their credit history without having to log into the LMS. Now, from my experience for the integrations, we've done both cases where the client only wants the LMS data to be within the LMS. That's the source of all certificates, all reporting and things like that. But we also have situations where the client wants their credit history displayed on their website. So the user can log into their profile and see their history, whether you're displaying their description of the course, the credits earned, completion dates. In some cases, we actually have the certificates available on the client website as well. And, you know, it's just a personal preference whether you want to use that LMS for that source entirely, or if you want to display that history and those certificates in, you know, a similar template and style of your member website.
Great.
So the only additional, sorry. No, I was just going to say the only additional thing here is, you know, it's important to work with your AMS partner or vendor to determine as well what you can or can't be displayed for your members as well. And this goes back to the integration process, which you're going to lead into next.
Right, thank you. So Chris and I, we've worked on several integrations over the past few years, and we worked together on integrations as well. And when we're looking at the integration process, every client is unique. Every client has different needs and different goals with their integrations. But we do find that there are some points in this process that are pretty standard, which I'm going to go over right now. So the first one is identifying your stakeholders. So these are the people who are going to be your champions in this whole process before and after the integration, who are going to champion your AMS and LMS integration. Chris, when you're working with your clients, what do you find like is important when identifying your stakeholders? What are some of those important points?
Yeah, so it's really important. And I wanted to mention really something on the champion. You know, to me, that's the person or group that is directly responsible for the implementation tasks and for making decisions. So it's very important overall to make sure you're obviously including the people that has the power to make those decisions.
Right. And, you know, your stakeholders are not necessarily just people within your organization, correct?
Right. That's your external stakeholders as well. So your vendor suppliers. So that would be your LMS vendor, of course. You're already working with them. Your AMS vendor, like AT. If you have other educational resources providing content for your LMS, even legacy LMS vendors. If you're migrating from a historical system to a new system, you're going to need to involve them in the process.
Right. And I mean, we'll talk a little bit about risks, but I think one of the things too that's important with identifying your stakeholders is that you're also identifying those stakeholders with the technical capacity to do that, and recognizing if maybe in your organization that maybe you don't have the technical requirements and you do have to engage your vendor or a consultant. So that's something that is really important when identifying stakeholders. The next step is scheduling the integration meeting. And Chris, why is this important?
This is to make sure everyone's on the same page. And you really want to have everyone involved at that point. So you can establish who's responsible for what, timelines, and to get the next step kicked off, which is the requirements.
Right. So in this meeting, those stakeholders that we were discussing, I mean, except for like the end users, but the ones that are going to be really working on that integration, you're going to want at that meeting. You want that to be, you want them to be involved so that everybody knows what's going on, what those milestones are, what the requirements, assets that need to be provided. It's all discussed during that meeting. So as I say, requirements, identifying the requirements, and why is this important, Chris?
This is very critical, especially for involving your AMS vendor. We understand your database, your membership processes, and there may be something on the technical side that you might not necessarily understand. So during this process, we'll identify, okay, do you need any custom integrations outside of the LMS or any custom development, such as do you have a website, or are you already logging in members to your website securely, or do we need to look at building something separately? Another example is, do you already have an online store that could easily be integrated, or do we need to plan to build that out as well? And also, if you're migrating historical data, which I identified in your stakeholders involving a legacy LMS vendor, you may need to involve them if you want to pull your old LMS data into your new LMS.
Right. Yeah. In some cases, in some cases when we're building that integration, sometimes all of it can be done right on the LMS side, where we're pulling that data and pushing it back to. We're pulling it from the AMS and pushing it back to the AMS on completion. But sometimes there are things that require custom development. Chris, do you have any examples from your point of view of when custom development is required?
Yes, I do have one. So it was actually an integration that we did, and they did not already have a online store. Or they did, but it was a custom solution that was built to their website. It wasn't built using the tools from their AMS. So we had to actually involve their web vendor for modifying their current store so that we could integrate it with the LMS. And that's something critical. If you miss that in the initial requirements, that could cost you a lot in the long run.
Right. And I think that kind of goes back to having those stakeholders during that integration where we're identifying the requirements. That's why it's so critical, so that something doesn't get missed and we have to do rework and it could potentially delay that integration completion. So next we have provide web service information. So this is when we're talking, if you go back to the terms, this is where we're talking about SOAP or REST API information. Chris, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so this is a critical point too, because Web Courseworks would be providing their SOAP APIs, which would enable us to integrate the process for creating new users to the LMS, which is integrated with the single sign-on, as well as facilitating enrollment. So when a purchase is actually made for a course, so that we can use those APIs to send that purchase data back over. At this point as well, if we have to integrate any custom APIs on the AMS end, we will also provide them back to Web Courseworks at that point.
Right. And this is the one thing that I find with the web service information, we want that early on in this process. So I mean, I know it's like number 4, but if you notice, we need that information before we begin the development, because it allows us to connect, to make sure that the connection is working. And when we're doing the quality assurance testing, we're making sure that the data that is supposed to be flowing between the two systems is actually flowing. So if there's any one piece of advice, if you're considering an integration, I would gather that information early. And usually your LMS vendor or your AMS vendor will let you know what data would be necessary. And then we go into development. So and the development, again, it's against those requirements that are identified, and we utilize the web service information. Chris, how is development unique when you're doing an integration from client to client? I mean, do you find that there are standard processes, or is it different for everyone?
No, we try to use standard processes and try to, replicate what we do for each client. It saves time and saves money, but there are the cases where we will have some different configurations, as what we talked about earlier, as far as the data we're sending over through the SSO. Usually at this point, we already have that configured on the AMS side, and it's just a matter of supporting Web Courseworks for making sure that they're seeing the correct data that we're sending over, whether it's profile data or course completion data, or I'm sorry, not course completion data, but course purchase data. Right.
And I think that's really important. I mean, even from our end, we are utilizing the best practices that, because as I mentioned before, Chris and I have been through many integrations, and we know, when things go, like, we have processes of when things go well and when things don't go well. So having those best practices and those standard procedures in place is really important during that, during this process. So that's something when you're talking to a vendor or your LMS vendor, just asking, what are those standard operating procedures during development. And then finally, we go into testing. And I'm a quality assurance girl at heart. So the testing is very important during this process. So Chris, why is it important from the client standpoint for them to do testing?
It's very important. You don't want to put something live that you haven't tested from all aspects. I mean, regarding the LMS integrations, you're going to want to test all your use cases. So if you're, purchase or have courses available at different price levels for different types of memberships, you're going to want to make sure you've tested all those before going live. I think we'll talk a little bit about this later on here, but it's also important to have more than one person on your internal team testing. You want to have multiple people involved in the project to do that and provide feedback.
Right. Yeah, and I think also the thing about testing when I'm talking with clients is, and I encourage them to do their own testing and spending time in the system and understanding that process, so that when you are live and when you have users coming through and they run into problems, you have a good understanding of how that process is supposed to work. When the completion data should be writing back. So then you're able to troubleshoot, and you're empowered to troubleshoot on your own before going to your vendors and asking, hey, what's wrong here? So at least you do a little bit of pre-troubleshooting ahead of time. I do have a question from Michelle. It says, regarding standard process, roughly how long does the standard process take? And I'm assuming that when we're talking about standard process for the integration development, and it varies. And Chris, jump in here if you find, but it really depends when we get to those requirements, when we really understand what you're looking for in the SSO profile pull, and then the write back, if you have a write back. If you don't have a write back, it's going to be a shorter overall time frame. Chris, what are your thoughts on that?
This will sound like I'm deflecting the question, but I'm not. But just because of the relationship we have in working with you guys or Web Courseworks, we typically rely on you to lay out the timeline and the milestones, and then we'll schedule accordingly on our end.
Sure. Yeah. If you want me to put a number around it, I mean, it's different. It's really different for everyone. It really depends how much custom integration development is being done. And the hours can vary. But I mean, one of the things that I can say is, if we're talking about Web Courseworks, and every LMS vendor or AMS vendor is different, we do use a sprinting process where we segment our development into 1 week of development and 1 week of quality assurance testing. Now, again, I'm not saying that it would take 1 week to develop your integration. It would usually take probably a little bit longer than that, but that's one way to think about if we go into sprints. But that's another webinar for another time. But again, testing the development, again, it can vary. So I hope that answered your question, Michelle, or helped a little bit. So, all right. Anything else on the integration process, Chris, before we move into the next poll?
No, we can go ahead and move ahead.
Okay, great. So we have another poll. Now, some of you have experienced integration, some of you have not. And again, it might not be with the AMS, it might be with a different type of software platform. But the question that we have is, what integration challenges have you experienced? And mark as many as you can. These are just some of the ones that we have seen. And we'll give you just a few more seconds. All right, so we're going to go ahead and close the poll. And Odessa, if you can share, thank you. So it does seem overwhelmingly the biggest challenge that you have during your integrations, the lack of technical support from vendors. Chris, what do you think of that? What are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends from what perspective, because if you're approaching one of these projects, and we're going to touch on this on the next slide here in a few minutes, but you know, if you're actively engaging and including your vendors, specifically your AMS vendor, and they're fully engaged and you truly have a relationship, so if you didn't have those factors, I could see where you could fall short on this side.
Right. Right, and I agree. I think it comes to having that champion and establishing that relationship with your vendors for the technical support. And if we go to the next slide, and don't get me wrong, there are other things here like the missed requirements, too many stakeholders. Those are also things that happen pretty often as well that can be a challenge during an integration. But you know, during the integration, there are some best practices if you are considering one with an AMS to your LMS, or if you're considering one with your like another platform. There are some do's and don'ts that we recommend. The first one is have the right people in the room. And this, again, kind of goes to that technical experience, you know, making sure your vendor is there if you need your vendor. Knowing which versions of the AMS and LMS you're integrating with. And that is really important too. Some of our the platforms that we work with have different versions and work slightly differently from version to version. So knowing that information is good to know. Communicating openly. I cannot stress this enough. If you're running into challenges, let us know. Let your AMS vendor know, or the LMS vendor know, because we can help with that. Stick with your must-haves.
Yeah, I'll speak on that.
Go ahead. Say that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I actually had this point because, you know, I liked when I engage in projects with clients and with our vendors, you know, I want to stay on task, stay efficient. So, you know, we don't run into problems with timelines and changing requirements, but really your must-have should be defined at the beginning stages. And these are things that are really critical for the functionality of your LMS. Maybe an LMS or has all the functions, bells and whistles, but maybe that's not something we could get integrated in the initial phase, or you don't have the time or the resources to do so. So some of the must-haves I see is mobile responsive design for your LMS and easy access, accessibility, and having a single sign-on. I always say don't be afraid to say, let's do this in phase 2 so we can keep things on track for our go live date.
Right. And I agree with that. Sticking with those must-haves. And, you know, if your vendor says, hey, we can't do this, be prepared to like say, no, we really do need this from the other perspective of that, because that'll help both your LMS and your AMS vendor know what you actually need. And then the other do that we recommend is integrating only the data you need. And Chris, you spoke a little bit about this before.
Yeah, so really the advantage of working with an AMS partner rather than trying to integrate this yourself is, and I may have mentioned this, but we know your database and your system, and there's no need to have redundant data on both the LMS and the AMS side. And I would say just depend on your AMS vendor to guide you on this aspect of the project.
Mm-hmm. So for the don'ts, one of the very first one is don't be afraid to ask questions. Sometimes in these technical meetings, especially in that integration meeting, things get a little in the weeds when it comes to the technical functions of an integration. And if we lose you, say something. That is one way that's going to help you understand it. Because at the end of the day, you have to live with this integration. We'll help you with everything, but it's going to be yours to manage. So not develop, but manage afterwards. And we're going to talk about maintenance next. But don't be afraid to ask questions if you don't understand. We are there to help you, and we're there to help you be successful as well. Overlook security. Chris, why is security so important when talking about integration?
Yeah, and this goes beyond security. You might think, okay, just logging in, but no, there's other factors such as, do you have any GDPR, or that's the General Data Protection Regulation, which is the data protection and privacy for individuals within the EU. Do you need to consider any of those items for your integration? Another example, are you using an e-commerce solution outside of your AMS, such as a custom solution? Make sure you adhere to PCI compliance for that, right. As well as, not to get too technical, but you'll want to make sure you're using SSL certs for your websites as well for encryption, as well as for any web services that you integrate.
Right.
Sorry, go ahead.
No.
I was going to say the last part for the security too, it does get down to what your end users or members can or can't see regarding courses on your website as well. We have many configurations where they only want members to see specific courses on their website, and if they're a non-member, they'll either see different courses or have different pricing levels on their website.
Right. Don't rush the launch of your LMS. And this kind of goes back to, this is going to be yours to work with afterwards. You're going to be doing the troubleshooting, and the most important thing when I'm working with a client, and Chris, you can jump in here too, but one of the most important things is your comfort level, because one of the things I don't want after you go live is, if you have a support package or a consultative services package, you don't want to use that up within the first few months of you going live. You want to be stable, but you also want to make sure that integration, you're comfortable with troubleshooting. Chris, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, that encompasses it all. We don't want to get into a situation where we have to, make shortcuts and compromise the project. So right. Again, in this case, I fully depend on Web Courseworks for defining the timeline. They're the experts in this right. area, and you do it well. So,
well, thank you. And then finally, don't forget to fully test your new LMS before it goes live. And again, that goes to the comfort, the troubleshooting. It really it kind of ties into that previous one. We want to make sure that you're ready to go, that you know what the user experience is going to be like, and if you see something wrong, you're able to identify what is wrong, and you're not expected to be an expert when you go live, but you're able to identify what is wrong, and you're able to communicate it with your vendors as needed. So I think that's one of the things to kind of think about when you're doing any sort of LMS launch. Okay. So doing an integration between an LMS and the AMS does not go without any risk. And so we did identify a few of the risk factors that may happen. So Chris, I'm going to let you talk about the AMS.
Yeah, so you need to consider where your AMS database is housed or hosted. We have situations where clients self-host, they host somewhere else. Maybe they don't know where they're hosted. So it's very important that you know what kind of access you have to those environments, both for the vendors you're working with, as well as if you have your own internal IT, do they have full access to those environments? So did you have anything to add to that, or do you want me to keep going?
No, keep going.
Okay, IP and firewall access. This comes into play for web services. You know, are there any IP restrictions? Do you need to, you know, open up some ports on your firewall to allow the transfer between the web Courseworks and your AMS web services? Tech quality, by that, I'm referring to using the best practice standards for integrations and vendors. We already talked about vendors who have the expertise in what you're already doing. Vendors that have good reputations as well. Test use cases for varying member types. We have already talked about this in regarding to testing. Make sure that you test all user scenarios. I've gone into integrations before, again, where, well, we didn't test this specific member type. So that can cause some lapse in getting things live. And then scope creep, which is really just changes, continuous or uncontrolled growth in the project's scope. So this occurs a lot when the scope isn't properly defined and documented at the beginning process.
Right. And just to kind of circle back to the IP and firewall access, that is one of the things that I find gets tripped up early in that development process, is we're going to try and connect and send information just from like a quick test, or the developer is trying to test, and that IP and firewall access does become a barrier at times. I try to, whenever I'm working with clients, I try to give that information for our sites up front, so they have that information right away and they can do the whitelisting that's available. So when you're working with your vendors, you know, ask that question, you know, what sort of whitelisting do I need to do? What IP addresses do I need? From the LMS side, one of the risk factors that we run into is limited test access. One of the things we ask, you know, during that web service requirement, if we go back to that previous slide where we're talking about the process, we also ask for test users. So we're able to test on our end to make sure things are working as well. Now, sometimes when we have test users, if you don't expose all the information that they need in the AMS, it's hard for us to validate that things are actually working as they should. So sometimes that limited test access slows down the entire development process and testing process. So now, I'm not saying that you have to expose this information, but we should have a contact point when we are doing that testing, that we can say, hey, John, can you check to see if my John Doe user information came back? So that is going to be one of the key things that we would need. Providing resources on time to keep schedule. And that happens, that's across any LMS or AMS implementation or integration. You know, getting those resources that we require, or those assets on time and completed to us is very important, because then we're able to stay on track. And I'm sure, as Chris can attest, you know, our development schedules are pretty tight, and we want to make sure that we're keeping everything together on that side, because, you know, the key is to get you guys out to market. So. And then finally, and we've brought this up several times, is bringing in unnecessary data during the SSO profile sync. One thing too, just to kind of keep in mind, you know, when you bring in more data than what you really need, there could be some performance issues, whether you're downloading a report or maybe just a little bit of slowness from the user side. So again, looking for that value that you're going to find, bringing in only what you need is going to be key to mitigate that risk. So we'll let the fire truck go by. Okay. So the next slide. So finally, our last slide before we open the floor for questions is maintaining your integration. So we've talked a lot about the process of bringing your integration, your LMS and your AMS together. But you know, what happens afterwards? What happens when that's all done and you got users coming through, and now you're in that maintenance phase, and it's just as important as when you're integrating. So something to keep in mind is integration maintenance is ongoing. You still want that champion to be involved, to identify the improvements and opportunities to integration, that continuous improvement. Listening to your users about what's working and what's not working is going to be really important. And then communicating that to your vendors is going to be key. Empowering that champion to troubleshoot. Again, that goes back to getting in there and doing your testing and understanding that process and being able to troubleshoot on your own. Understanding your upgrade path. And Chris, I'm going to let you talk about that because you've run into this a little bit more than I have.
Yeah, so on my end, it's important, for example, if you're upgrading your AMS, there also may be upgrades required on the LMS end. APIs change, security changes. Having your AMS partner, you know, with we say we're in this together approach. We're truly partnering on this. It's not just business. And you know, for this point, your AMS partner is there to support that integration between your LMS and AMS. Should anything change with upgrades, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, and there have been times when I've started an implementation where there's an integration, and then the client has said, "Oh, we're going to be updating our AMS in 3 months." So understanding that upgrade path, planning for that is going to be very important. And it's also important to let your LMS vendor and your, you know, when you're working with your AMS vendor, to let them know. In most cases, it's not going to be too much of a change, but you know, it's good to have that open communication. Response and accessibility to support from your vendors. And I think this goes back to that poll question where we talked about the lack of technical support from vendors. It seems to be one of the biggest things that people run into. And I think from, you know, it's important for your vendors and for you to set that expectation at the beginning, making sure that, you know, the vendors know, you know, who's going to be coming to them and talking to them, and then also for us to let you guys know how to contact us, how to report issues. I think that's going to be really important. Also, what the SLAs are, the service level agreements, so that you're aware. Chris, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, it comes down to trust. From day one, you need to have trust with those vendors. Faith that they're doing, you know, what's best for you as well. Again, I'm going to go back to that we're in this together approach. So within our partnerships, such as with Web Courseworks, we're there during the entire process, from requirements to go live and thereafter. We sort of become, you know, the product owner from the AMS side for your LMS system. It's not the approach where, okay, we're done with the LMS integration, let's move on, and the support ends. It's not that case at all.
Right, and I agree with that. That is one of the most important things when you're working with your vendors, is having somebody that you can trust. And then finally, involve vendors in your plans. I think that is really important for forward planning, letting them know where you see yourself in a year or 2 years or 5 years, you know, and 5 years is far out, but if you know, communicating that, because from Chris's end, and I'm sure from Chris's end and my own, we can draw on experience, we can draw on to make those goals.
Yeah, I would just add to this. So I was actually speaking with a client the other day, and, you know, I was like, well, you know, what challenges did you have? And one of the things they said is they wish they would have used our company a little more regarding their full processes. So in this case, it's a relatively new client, and they just wish they would have engaged us more during the integration about what they do for their members and their educational offerings, more communication about their business processes, practices, and what they kind of want to do with a year from now within their LMS, just so that we have that on the roadmap.
Right. All right, Chris, anything else to that slide on maintaining the integration?
Yeah, the only thing I would add, and you're kind of getting the sense from this, but you really need to, when I look at the perspective of engaging a vendor to work for your integration versus trying to do it yourself internally, there's definitely a cost involved of trying to learn the technology, the cost of the service, the product, time savings, labor savings. I mean, I can't say it enough. It's just very important to engage your AMS vendor. And I've said this already, we know your database inside and out, and where each piece of data should touch your database and where it shouldn't.
Right. Right, great. Well, we have a few minutes left, so if you have any questions, please put it into the questions pane. There is one question that went unanswered, so I'm going to circle back. This came from Michelle, and the question was, other than monetary reasons, is there any reason to have an e-commerce portion? So, Chris, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, if you're doing courses that have fees, you definitely want an e-commerce solution or some way to actually process those transactions and get them back into your database, correct? I mean, if you're offering courses where there is no purchase required, and per se you're doing like auto enrollments, then in that case, I don't believe you'd need a e-commerce solution.
We have another question from Vyar. I apologize if I said your name wrong. Which is the most effective way to do SSO, like SAML versus API? Ooh, Chris, I'm going to pass that one to you.
That might be for a more technical webinar.
Yeah, that's a very technical question.
Yeah, you really need to defer to your AMS vendor who's supporting your system. The web Courseworks integration is very flexible. We haven't done any SAML integrations, but that's not to say that web Courseworks hasn't. So,
right, and we have done SAML integrations, and it hasn't been for a while. I think I mentioned earlier in the webinar that I've been seeing more of a trend towards a REST API solution as opposed to SAML or SOAP. But that doesn't mean that, the next one that comes in won't be a SAML. So, yeah, no, that's a great question, and I agree, Chris, that really deferring to your vendor on that one. Any other questions before we wrap it up? All right. Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a great topic. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. We will be sending you a short post survey will help us improve the quality of our webinars. We'll also be sending a follow-up email to all registrants with a link to the webinar recording. So if you had to leave early or if you want to give it to a friend, you can look at that. So thank you all so much and have a great day.